So guys, over the years, we've had people coming up front explaining the origin of Christianity. People have said for so many times that Christianity is a Western religion. But I personally say Christianity is neither an Eastern religion or a Western religion. Christianity is a religion that was rooted in the Middle East. In Middle East, it got its way here in Africa. Remember, we have Bible verses that explain, and they even mention African countries such as Libya. They mention Egypt, and they mention countries such as Ethiopia. In fact, one of those countries which have the oldest religion is Ethiopia. Ethiopians have the oldest religion, and this religion of Ethiopia is rooted all the way from the religion of Judaism. So religions are three in the Middle East. We have the Judaism, we have the Islam, then we have the Christianity. These three religions are called the Abrahamic religions. You understand? Each have the same correspondence, and they tell almost the same narrative. Judaism is rooted on the Old Testament of the Christianity, but Christianity includes the introduction of Jesus Christ as the Messiah who came to rescue this world from the sins that was there separating God and man. So he came to bring a bridge between God and man. Islam does not really appreciate or really put emphasis on the role of Jesus Christ as the Messiah. To them, Jesus Christ was just a prophet by the name Isa. Now we have this part of Africa. Where does Africa fall into? Because Africa has been mentioned many times to have the oldest religion. We have Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. We have the Queen of the South who visited King Solomon because she heard of the great wisdom that Solomon had. I'm telling you, there's a perspective of Christianity that Africans are holding. And now there's this pastor by the name Fred Price has a different perspective, and he's going to explain to us to bring the distinction between these Abrahamic religions and the real religion we have in Africa, because it borrows from those Abrahamic laws found in the Middle East. Now, without further ado, and to acquire more understanding into this video, I want us to dive here and then watch it. By the end of the video, I shall give you my thoughts, where we shall also have a deep critical analysis. Let's dive in right away.
And that's where all these strange colors come from. You go into darkest Africa, you ain't gonna find no yellow folk like this. You won't find no high yellows there. As such, not as original Africans. Okay? Now pick up on this. This is a marvelous thing that this man is saying, to us. And we need to realize this. He says that more than 600,000 men, 20 years and old and up, left Egypt, which must have been an additional 2 or 3 million women and children. Since the Jews were slaves, their women were undoubtedly concubines of the Egyptian and must have produced mixed offspring. After more than 400 years of slavery, almost every trace of the first 70 Jews must have been lost, together with their culture. Sound just like black folk in America. Same thing. Okay? After more than 400 years of slavery, almost every trace of the first 70 Jews must have been lost, together with their culture. Thus, Jewish culture was Egyptian culture. To get an idea of what must have happened to those original 70 Jews, think of what has happened to Negroes in the United States who came here in hundreds of thousands over a period of centuries, and not all at once as the Jews did in Egypt. In other words, the 70 went to Egypt at one time, but the blacks were not brought in at one time. They were brought in over quite a few hundred years. Watch this now. Negroes are so Americanized that were it not for their color, one would forget that they ever came from Africa. Now watch this. The Falashas, or black Jews of Ethiopia, are probably very ancient. They claim lineal descent from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Call themselves Beta Israel, which means the chosen people, and observe the Passover. End of quote. In Sex and Race, Volume 1, page 28, Mr. Rogers says, and I quote, increasingly, it is being said in the most informed scientific circles that the Negro was the ancestor of the human race. Henry Fairfield Osborn, late head of the American Museum of Natural History, who undoubtedly was a black man, head of the American Museum of Natural History, who had himself a strong tinge of white fanaticism, said, Negroid stock is even more ancient than Caucasian or Mongolian man. Henry Fairfield Osborn was a white man. Now, from Man Rises to Parnasius, page 201, Princeton, New Jersey, 1928. Men of the Old Stone Age, quoting, Men of the Old Stone Age, page 262, 278, and 279, 1918. Mr. Rogers goes on to say, Griffith Taylor says, and I quote, a major principle of ecology tells us that the Negrito was therefore the earliest to develop of the 5 races. From environment, and I quote, from environment and race, page 230, London, 1927, environment and nation, on page 87, Chicago, printed in Chicago, 1936. Rogers continues, there were several of these put together. It might sound a little confusing, but you get the tape and you'll be able to go back and get it. Rogers continues, Professor W.K. Gregory, in the illustrated front piece of his book, entitled, and I quote, Our Face from Fish to Man, end of quote, gives the Tasmanian Negro as the first man. Rene Verneau, head of the Paleontological Institute of Paris says, and I quote, recent discoveries seem to indicate that the Negro element preceded the white and the yellow everywhere, end of quote. From, and I quote, Huxley Memorial Lectures for 1924. See, this stuff, they've been knowing about this stuff. You didn't get none of this in school. They didn't tell the black folk about it, and they didn't tell the white folks about it. 1924. Huxley Memorial Lecture for 1924 on page 20. Rogers, see, Rogers is a historian, so he's putting all these different things together. All this is in his book, but he's quoting from other authorities and authors, so that's why I'm trying to keep all this together. Huxley Memorial Lectures for 1924, page 20, Rogers continues, and I quote, Griffith Taylor adds in support that the Negritos, or little Negroes, were the first in Europe. After the Neanderthal, a near-human Negroid type, and that the Negritos introduced their culture all over the world. The original color of primitive man was black. He says, now, in a book entitled, going to another place now, in a book entitled The Greek Historians by Godolphin, copyright 1942, Random House Incorporated, in the book called Herodotus, chapter 104 and 105, on pages 130 and 131. Now, Herodotus was considered the father of history. Now watch this. Quoting Herodotus, who, by the way, lived 500 years before Christ and was called the father of history. Quoting, there can be no doubt that the Colchians are an Egyptian race. Before I heard any mention of the fact from others, I had remarked it myself. This is Herodotus talking. After the thought had struck me, I made inquiries on the subject both in Colchis and in Egypt. And I found that the Colchians had a more distinct recollection of the Egyptians than the Egyptians had of them. Colchis, This is my insertion now. Caucasus, by the way, was an ancient province in Asia, east of the Black Sea. Going on to quote Herodotus. Still, the Egyptians said that they believed the Caucasians to be descended from the army of Sesostris. My own conjectures were founded first, get this now, first on the fact that they are black-skinned and have woolly hair, which certainly amounts to but little, since several other nations are so too. But I further and more especially on the circumstance that the Caucasians, the Egyptians, and the Ethiopians are the only nations who have practiced circumcision from the earliest times. The Phoenicians and the Syrians of Palestine themselves confess that they learnt the custom of the Egyptians. And the Syrians who dwell about the rivers Thermodon and Parthenius, as well as their neighbors, the Macronians, say that they have recently adopted it from the Caucasians. Now, these are the only nations who use circumcision, and it is plain that they all imitate herein the Egyptians. With respect to the Ethiopians, indeed, I cannot decide whether they learned the practice of the Egyptians or the Egyptians of them. It is undoubtedly a very ancient date in Ethiopia, but that the others derived their knowledge of it from Egypt is clear to me, from the fact that the Phoenicians, when they come to have commerce with the Greeks, cease to follow the Egyptians in this custom and allow their children to remain uncircumcised. I will add a further proof of the identity of the Egyptians and the Caucasians. These two nations weave their linen in exactly the same way. And there is a way, and this is a way entirely unknown to the rest of the world. They also in their whole mode of life and in their language resemble one another. The Caucasian linen is called by the Greeks Sardonian, while that which comes from Egypt is known as Egyptian. In his book entitled, that's the end of quote. In his book entitled From Superman to Man by J.A. Rogers, copyright 1968 by Helga M. Rogers, page 18 and 19, historian J.A. Rogers says, Aristotle, in his Physiognomy, chapter 6, distinctly mentions the Ethiopians as having woolly hair and the Egyptians as being black-skinned. Now, every movie you have seen about Egypt, Pharaoh, dogs and the cats are all white. The only time you see a black is when he's a slave. All right. Now, Rogers goes on to say, and I quote, Count M.C. de Volney, author of The Ruins of Empire, says, the ancient Egyptians were real Negroes of the same species as the other present natives of Africa. End of quote. De Volney further states in the same work, says Rogers, quoting again, to the race of Negroes, oh, watch this now, to the race, now this de Volney was a Frenchman, so he'd be classified as white. Okay, now watch this now. And I'm quoting, to the race of Negroes, the object of our extreme contempt, we owe our arts, sciences, and even the very use of speech. End of quote. They didn't teach us this in school. Only thing they taught us is that we came over on slave ships and picked cotton. That's about it. I mean, really. You know, overall as a whole. All right, now. Admittedly, the references we have looked at thus far could certainly be classified as past history. So let's bring it closer to our day and time. In an article in the Washington Post, another Negro-owned and operated publication, the Washington Post, copyright 1994, The Washington Post, November 16, 1994, Wednesday, final edition, byline by Boyce Rensberger, Washington Post staff writer, I quote, "The overwhelming conclusion of anthropologists, in short, is that no physical features distinguish any race, not even a combination of traits that will do the job. We all descended from black people." Bye. We walk by faith, not by sight.
Now, after clearly listening to what the professor has said, the pastor, he is not a professor, after clearly listening to what he said, you know, many times the West has lied to us. The West has given us notions that they want us to believe, notions that are really false. You understand? One thing I always know is that even right now, if you look at the map of Africa, you will find that Egypt has extended up to the Middle East. It's actually not hard to travel from Egypt all the way to the Middle East. It wasn't hard. Back during those days, even it's written in the book of Genesis, the father of the Abrahamic faith, the father of religion in Middle East was Abraham. He transported himself from Israel all the way to Egypt. If those people didn't have that technology you have today, and they would come to Egypt, it shows you and it tells you the close proximity we have with one another between Africa and the Middle East. Also, we've come to discover that human beings were originally black. Yeah, all human beings have originated from a black person. You know, some point we always say that Charles Darwin is lying, Charles Darwin is this and that, but there comes a point you come back and you ask yourself, who is really lying? Who is really lying? Is it the person who inspired Charles Darwin, or is it the person who wants Charles Darwin to be taught in schools? You understand? When Charles Darwin is taught in schools, we are told that human beings evolved. And we are told that they evolved from apes. Some apes were even found in Europe, all that. I personally don't believe human beings came from apes. I believe they were created. And if we were created, I believe so, and I know we were. We came all the way from Africa. By the way, Charles Darwin himself also goes to the extent of saying that the original man came from Africa. That is what Charles Darwin says, because he found a lot of remains in Africa, specifically East Africa. During his processes of excavation, archaeology, he found some remains here in Africa. We even studied them in our history books. But why do somebody go to the full extent of hiding the truth from people, making people feed on false information all their whole life? What is it that is bad about black that the white person does not want to acknowledge? When I say white person, I mean the very old people, those old people who came up with these textbooks, who came up with these theories. You understand? At some point, even geography supports that. At some point, the earth was one. It was one huge landmass. And this landmass was surrounded by water. Then, after a period of time, there occurred a certain geological process which caused this landmass to break apart. When this landmass broke apart, we had what is geographically called continental drift. Continental drift is when landmasses move from one another. Even now, if you take the coast of Africa, the western coast of Africa, the curve, and you fit it with South America, it fits very well. If you take that Madagascar piece and you fit it in East African coast, it fits well. If you take Asia, the Middle East, and you fix it to the north of Africa, it fits. This tells you one thing. Earth was once one place, and if it was once one place, there was a certain human who was black. This black person is the original person that God created. From this original person is when we have the brown people, we have the Chinese, we have the Japanese, we have the Indians, we have the people, all sorts of people came from black. And this has been supported by many theories. And now again, there was a certain movie that came out, I think somewhere last year. It was a Cleopatra video, and this director of this video did the abnormal. Huh? What they did is, normally the West always whitewash. They present those historical figures as white to those characters who are benevolent, to those characters who are good people. But for those characters who are lower people in the society, such as slaves, workers, are portrayed as black. In Egypt, it is shown to us by those Netflix movies that the Egyptian pharaoh was white. It's shown that the slaves were black. But how does it happen that all of the workers are slaves, but there's no any black person even in the society of, even as one of the ministers? This tells you it is a lie. This person from the Cleopatra movie represented Cleopatra as black, and the white people were like, no. They were so angry, guys. They were so angry. But are they angry because the truth has been told, or are they angry because something that they didn't want to know, or something that it would never ring in their mind that would happen has happened? Right now, even Africans, this idea of prejudice, idea of not liking oneself has reached so far. Africans are so much against Africans. In African will create room, even in a line, for a white person to pass. But when a fellow African comes to pass, they will refuse. This is the same problem that we saw in Nigeria with Chidima. Chidima, she was not Nigerian, she was not South African because she was black, but a white person who is clearly a white person, South African. She was called an African. A white person was called a South African, who is also an African in short. Why do we go against oneself and say, why then do you say you love Africa? You should stop saying you love Africa if you don't want anything with black. The truth has been revealed, and the truth is here. Africans are the original human beings, and if we have a religion such as Christianity, that religion is not a Western religion. It's a religion that came to Africa as long as possible. It might be true that Africans are the first to receive Christianity, even before the West. It might be true, but things have been tarnished. Things have been tarnished. Why? Should we now look back and say, no, we don't want anything to do with black history? The Bible speaks of black people as well. The Bible does not only speak of white people, it speaks of black people as well. Zipporah, the wife of Moses, it's told to us, I have heard, I'm not certain by this, by the way, but we've heard that Zipporah was a black woman, and the sister of Moses, Miriam, did not like Zipporah. Miriam was racist towards Zipporah. And for this reason, God is not a racist. He created us all. We are all his children. When God saw what Miriam was looking like, he decided to punish Miriam with leprosy. She had to cleanse herself from her sins. Is when she got healed. This tells us a lot about black history. Black history is deep and deep and deep than we can think. It is through pastors such as Pastor Price that we can get to learn a lot about black history. And you, I'm telling you right now to appreciate who you are, love who you are as a black person, never be discouraged of yourself. Yes. That's all for today. This is EFK Original Documentaries. If you like my content, do this, share, kindly support us on Patreon. It helps me help you with the good information. So kindly support me, subscribe, and see you in the next one.